Moses warned Pharaoh of God's command to release the Israelites, but Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. At God's command, Moses stretched his staff over the Nile, and its waters turned to blood. The lifeblood of Egypt became a curse. The river, once a source of life, now ran with blood. With no clean water to drink, Egyptians were left in desperation, digging for any source of fresh water. Even as the waters of the Nile ran with blood, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, refusing to let the Israelites go. The plague spread throughout the land, and Egypt's suffering grew, but Pharaoh would not relent. The plague of blood was only the first sign. Pharaoh's defiance would bring greater destruction upon Egypt. Pharaoh stood firm, refusing to let the Israelites go despite God's command. Moses told Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go, or I will bring a plague of frogs upon your land." Frogs poured out from the Nile, invading every part of Egypt. The frogs were everywhere, on the streets, in homes, and even in Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh told Moses, "Pray to your God to take these frogs away, and I will let your people go." Moses prayed to the Lord, asking for deliverance from the frogs. The frogs died, leaving piles of decaying bodies across the land. But when relief came, Pharaoh hardened his heart once again, refusing to free the Israelites. Once again, Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go, ignoring God's warnings. God spoke to Moses, instructing him to tell Aaron to use his staff. Following God's command, Aaron struck the dust of the earth, and something strange began to happen. The dust turned into lice, covering all of Egypt, invading every corner. Lice infested both people and animals, causing unbearable discomfort across the land. Pharaoh's magicians tried to replicate the miracle, but they could not. The power of God was too great. Even the magicians admitted it was the hand of God at work. But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He refused to release the Israelites despite the suffering around him. Despite the previous plagues, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He refused to let the Israelites go. God warned Pharaoh through Moses, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go, or I will send swarms of flies upon you, your servants and your people." The next day, swarms of flies filled the skies and covered the land of Egypt. Flies infested everything. But in the land of Goshen, where God's people, the Israelites, lived, not a single fly was found. In desperation, Pharaoh told Moses the Israelites could go worship their God, but only within Egypt's borders. Moses prayed to God and the flies vanished. Egypt was spared for the moment. As soon as the flies were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go, continuing the cycle of defiance. Moses warned Pharaoh that God would strike down all Egyptian livestock if he continued to refuse to free the Israelites. The very next day, the plague struck. Livestock across Egypt fell ill and died, leaving the fields silent. Egyptian farmers watched in horror as their animals, their livelihood, were wiped out in an instant. Even as his own officials begged him to listen, Pharaoh remained defiant, refusing to let the Israelites go. But the plague did not touch the livestock of the Israelites. They were protected, as promised by God. Despite the devastation around him, Pharaoh's stubbornness only grew. His heart hardened further against the Israelites. The land of Egypt was left in silence, but Pharaoh's refusal would bring even greater destruction. Pharaoh continued to defy Moses' warnings, and soon the next punishment arrived. At God's command, Moses took soot from a furnace and scattered it toward the sky. Painful boils appeared on the skin of Egyptians, spreading rapidly among people and animals alike. The plague wasn't limited to humans. Even animals were struck down, writhing in pain from the boils. Pharaoh's own magicians and advisors could do nothing, their bodies covered in boils, powerless against the curse. Even as the suffering worsened, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He refused to let the Israelites go. The plague of boils was just one of many signs, but Pharaoh's defiance would lead to even greater suffering for Egypt. The seventh plague brought by Moses was one of the most destructive, an intense storm of hail that devastated Egypt. At God's command, Moses stretched out his staff toward the heavens, and the storm began. Huge hailstones, mixed with fire, rained down on Egypt, destroying everything in their path. The hail flattened the fields, wiping out crops that provided food for the people and animals. Any animals left in the fields suffered under the relentless storm, with no protection from the deadly hail. Many Egyptians, caught off guard by the storm, ran for their lives as the hail smashed through homes and streets. Pharaoh witnessed the devastation firsthand, yet his heart remained hardened, still refusing to release the Israelites. Despite the overwhelming destruction, Pharaoh refused to yield, setting the stage for even greater suffering to come. At God's command, Moses stretched his hand toward Egypt, and an unstoppable swarm filled the skies. The sky turned black as millions of locusts covered the land, devouring everything in their path. In a matter of minutes, they consumed every crop and tree, leaving behind a barren, desolate landscape. The people of Egypt were powerless as the locusts invaded homes and fields, destroying their food and livelihood. Pharaoh watched in despair as Egypt was stripped bare, yet his heart remained hardened, still refusing to free the Israelites. When the locusts finally left, the land was desolate. Egypt was stripped of its resources, yet Pharaoh's pride remained intact. The plague of locusts was a clear warning, but Pharaoh's stubbornness would bring even greater suffering to Egypt. At God's command, Moses stretched out his hand, and darkness covered the land for 3 days. It was not just the absence of light. It was a deep, suffocating darkness that consumed everything. For 3 days, no one could see or move. Lamps couldn't pierce the darkness, and fear gripped the nation. Even Pharaoh, in his grand palace, was trapped in the darkness. But despite the terror, he refused to release the Israelites. Yet in the homes of the Israelites there was light. They were protected from the plague. Pharaoh, though surrounded by darkness and fear, hardened his heart once more, refusing to let the people go. The darkness lifted, but Pharaoh's defiance would lead to the final and most devastating plague. God's message was clear. The firstborn of every Egyptian family, from Pharaoh to the lowest servant, would perish. The Israelites, under Moses' guidance, marked their doors with lamb's blood so the angel of death would pass over them. At midnight, the angel of death swept through Egypt, striking down the firstborn in every household. The cries of mourning echoed through Egypt as families awoke to the heart-wrenching loss of their firstborn sons. Even Pharaoh, who had defied God's warnings, found himself in the grip of despair as his own son was taken. In his agony, Pharaoh summoned Moses and finally commanded that the Israelites leave Egypt once and for all. After years of suffering, the Israelites were finally freed. But the price Egypt paid for its defiance would never be forgotten.